Running. Okay. So remember Avodah Zara?
I remember the question, Rabbi, that you didn't answer.
There was only one I haven't answered yet?
Only one.
Okay, fire away.
Yeah. Remember when we got that a good connection as a bridge?
Yes, because it's been a while because of the high holidays.
1 month ago,
yes.
That you say that you can use something only if the idol
has annulled it.
Yes.
Yes.
Destroy it. So after the person, the idolater destroy it, you can use it.
After they annul it.
Yes.
And we're going to get to the definition of annulling tonight.
Yes. The question is, can I pay him as I pay and go in Shabbat to destroy something, to kneel something, so I can be kosher? Can I pay? Can I induce the process, or must come from his or her free will?
Yes. So the answer is yes to your question, because both parts are yes, so but they work together, right? Because look at it this way. We're going to talk about what annulment means in a bit, and that'll reinforce, I think, the answer. But since you've waited a month, I don't want to make you wait any longer. So when an idolater annuls an idol, that means they have behaved to the idol in a way that shows that they no longer consider it divine. That it would be like, if somebody did that to an idol, they don't consider it divine. And I think we talked a little bit about with the Torah, right? There are things you just wouldn't do with the Torah in the room. And if you did do that in the Torah in the room, everyone would know you did not respect the Torah, that they would not care for the Torah. Same thing, you could substitute a person, right? If your father's in the room and you decide to go to the bathroom in front of your father, it would be very clear that you did not respect him, right? If you slap him, if you insult him, that's a sign. If you sold your father, right, or if you sold the Torah because someone offered you enough money, would you still say that person respects the Torah? And you knew they were, and you knew that when you sold it to them, they were going to take it and use the paper for wallpaper in their house.
Oh, yeah. And what's happening again for people havers?
Oh, no. I'm not talking about.
Okay, you need the money.
I'm not talking about your life is in danger. I'm not talking about you're starving and you need food, although even there, I think most Jews would not. Right? They would find something else rather than selling the Torah to someone who was going to destroy it or disrespect it. Just a regular person, right? You own a Torah. Someone comes along and says, that would look so good in my bathroom. I'm looking for a really interesting decoration in my bathroom. I'll give you $100,000 for it. Let's imagine someone said yes, right?
You can buy a new one for 15,000. That would be.
All right. So someone says yes because that Torah, okay, fine. It's been in my family for 300 years, and but it's okay because I can buy a new one, right? Would you say, if I told you that story, that person really cares about the Torah, or would you say that person cares about money? They care about money. The same thing for an idolater, right? If you tell an idolater, look, I want to buy this idol from you, and I'm going to melt it down to make bracelets, the gold, or I'm going to take the idol, I'm going to break it up, and I want to make gravel for my road. And they sell it to you, knowing that's what you plan to do with it. They have clearly annulled it. They have clearly said, I don't believe this is God, because if I thought this was God, what would God do to me if I sold the idol to someone who's going to do this to it? Right? I mean, it would just be lightning bolts everywhere. So if you are willing to sell it in a way that will destroy it, and we're going to talk about the things that it takes to annul an idol, because the bar is kind of high, then yes, the person has annulled it. If they're willing to treat their God, in quotes, with disrespect like that, and we'll talk about what that definition is when we get there. If they're willing to treat their God like that, then they don't actually believe it's God. And that's the definition, the underlying essence of what it means to annul something, is that they no longer treat it like a God. So that's the short answer. It took 5 minutes. Yeah. So that's where we are, and then we'll talk about how the annulment works and what counts as annulment or not annulment in more detail in actually just 1 or 2 more Mishnayot. I believe, and this you're going to have to help me if I'm wrong. I believe we're on Mishnah 4:4 because we finished 4:3, right?
4:3.
We didn't.
We need to start
I looked at
4:3.
4:3 and it looked so familiar. I thought we had studied it. Okay,
No.
but we didn't study it together. Okay, so 4:3. So Avodah Zara, chapter 4, Mishnah 3. Okay, and I need a reader. Don't all volunteer. What?
Come on, Michelle. You are the greatest here
All right.
between all of us.
It means you have the best diction.
No,
Yes.
sometimes I'm lost. Thank you. Okay, so Mishnah 3:1.
Mhm.
If an idolatrous shrine has a garden or a bathhouse, one may use either so long as it is not to the advantage of the idolaters.
Okay, go ahead and read part A.
But one may not use either if it is to its advantage.
All right, quick map. And this is a very real question if you're in a world where there are idolaters. We're looking at a map of an idolatrous temple, right? And in the temple, right, this is where they've got their idol, right? And in the temple, that's where people go and they bow and they pray to their idol and they make their offerings and all the other stuff that idolaters do. But over here, you know, they've got this lovely little park that goes through their grounds. And you're walking along. You say, that's a pretty park.
In Haifa,
The Baha'i?
Bahari,
Most people do not consider the Baha'i idolaters, right? Most people consider them to be monotheists because they don't have any statues, they don't use any images to worship towards. They have a different text, yes, and they have their own ideas about God, but they do believe that there's only one God. They disagree about the number of prophets, but they don't believe that there's multiple gods. So the Baha'i Gardens doesn't quite fit. But imagine you go back to Rome, you know, 500 years or 1,000, 2,000 years ago. That's better. 2,000 years ago, you're in Rome. And Rome had beautiful gardens that were connected to Jupiter, right? Or Venus and other idols that they had. The question is, am I allowed to go through the garden? Am I allowed to enjoy the garden? Even though I know that this is Aphrodite's garden. And the answer that we have here is, what would you say? What did the Mishnah just teach us? I'm standing at the gate. I need an answer.
You cannot use it.
I can't?
As long as it's not for the advantage of them.
Okay. So if there's an admissions fee, and right? If you have to pay to get in, right? If you have to pay to get in, if you have to do something that benefits the shrine, that benefits the religious organization that has this, then keep walking. On the other hand, if it's just a bunch of trees and plants and they're not worship, we talked about that before, but they're just there because they're pretty, sure, walk through, enjoy the view, right?
Or maybe if they require you to bow when you get in.
Absolutely, yes. If they're forcing you to worship, and that's of course a big problem, right? But if it's just walking through the garden, even though the garden is associated with the temple, as long as you're not benefiting them, and as long as you're obviously not worshiping, the rabbi said, yes, that's okay. And we're going to push it one step even further.
If the garden or bathhouse belong jointly to it and to others, one may use them whether it be to the advantage of idolatry or not.
All right. So down over here, right? This is the goldsmith, and the goldsmith and the temple of Jupiter. They both take care of the garden. Right? They both are responsible for the garden. They both own the garden. They're partners for the garden. And the goldsmith and the temple agree that people who come into our garden should pay. Because, you know, it's a nice garden. Or bathhouse or any other kind of service that isn't actually idolatrous, but now it's connected to the temple. If the goldsmith and the temple jointly own this, even if it's an unequal partnership and all of that, but just there's at least some joint with a non-idolatrous entity, now you can pay admission. You can pay and go in because the money you pay is assumed to benefit the goldsmith, not the idol. I know, so liberal, right?
Well, it's the same concept is we learn on Shabbat that you have a business with an
Correct.
partner is not Jew, okay, you can open on Shabbat because it's not you, it's him.
Exactly. Exactly. And it is. I mean, that's what the rabbis believe the Torah is teaching us, is that the Torah says that you're not allowed to benefit the idolater. It doesn't say you're not allowed to benefit a goldsmith who may also be benefiting the idolater. You're not, the wall isn't that high and that far to separate. If there's a reasonable expectation that the benefit I'm giving is going to help something that's not idolatrous, that's good enough. That's a reasonable enough assumption. And pay your admission, enjoy the bath, enjoy the garden, whatever. Obviously, still, you don't go bow and worship and offer and stuff.
That's still not acceptable.
Right, you're not allowed. But walking through the garden is fine, even with your paying an admission, as long as there is some other association with that garden, that bathhouse, that service, other than the idol.
So what I learned in all these years taking this class is the best business, okay? A policy is associated with someone from different religion. You cover itself, each other. Yeah. Because also for them, like, okay, we have some partner, right. Also for 1% or 0.5% of the
profits.
Of the profit, great, but we have the Ushpanta that right. That's it, we can have more flexibility in business.
There are a few problems, right? So that's not the perfect business solution. Because if an idolater and another non-Jew make this arrangement, we've got no problem. A Jew, on the other hand, even though I said goldsmith, that's not, Mr. Goldsmith, that's a job. A Jew is not allowed to work with a blatant idolater, right? You can't make that arrangement. So as a Jew, if I want to have a joint store, like a grocery store that's open on Shabbat, because I'm in a partnership, I'm not doing that with the priests of Baal. I may be doing that with Chris Christensen, or Muhammad Ali, but I'm not doing that with an actual blatant idolater in undeniable. And we've talked before about how the other definitions can sometimes be argued about, but clearly if it's a real idolater, you're not going in partnership with that, because remember, the whole point of idolatry in the ancient world was it was an exploitative, a tyrannical, it was a terrible system of life. And as a Jew, you don't want to get mixed up in that. You don't want to get mixed up in that, not just because it's against Torah, but you don't want to get mixed up in that because it's dangerous. These were people who we couldn't usually trust for the ancient world. And that's why I'm very glad we don't live in that kind of society now.
But yes, you can do business, not be partner, but yes, do business.
Yes, do business. Yeah. Remember,
with the exception of
exactly right. From the first chapter, there were some exceptions. Yeah. But yeah, if you want to go to the wagon seller and the wagon seller worships Zeus, you can still buy a wagon from him. You can't buy it on Zeus's birthday, but you can still buy a wagon from him. Yes. So yes, there are ways, and sometimes even good and helpful ways to live in a, let's use the diplomatic term, a cosmopolitan society. It's not terrible to live in that cosmopolitan society. Are there limits? Are there restrictions? Are there things that change the calculation? Yes. But it is not the end of the world if there's an idolater living down the street. There's ways to work around that. Okay, now we're on 4:4.
Oh, before you do that,
yes.
I gotta give you another example. I came across the situation and it made me think about, because you already had talked about this, but I wanted to set it up in a different, how it happened to my girlfriend. Now, my girlfriend is a Christian, and she had a friend of hers that's a realtor, not a friend, but an acquaintance, and he's a realtor.
Probably not that good one.
Does she need a better realtor?
And
because you are lucky that you have here the best realtor.
I know, but anyway.
But this is before she knew you.
Yeah. Before I knew.
Just for the record.
So she tells me that this particular gentleman is a Catholic, and that his priest had told him that he needed to bury a Saint Joseph in his yard so that the house would sell.
Okay.
And so they buried the Joseph upside down the other way, took him out, buried several different ways, the house wouldn't sell.
Okay.
So my girlfriend told her, well, listen, you shouldn't rely on that. You should actually be praying to God directly. I mean, if you believe in God, you have to pray to God. Turns out the guy did that, unburied whatever was there, and he sold the house in 2 weeks. But what is interesting is in that situation, it's more like that was an idolatry type of situation. Would you say? I mean, it's just a very.
I wouldn't call it necessarily idolatry. There are people who do.
A good luck
Well,
charm again.
even in Judaism, there are people who go into what are called sigulot, that are signs, that are tricks that will bring good luck or will avoid bad luck.
So we're going back to the same concept.
And it's not necessarily idolatry because they're not worshiping the item,
Exactly.
but they somehow think that if they throw salt over your shoulder, or if you skip 3 times, or if you do this or don't do that, that it'll make good luck. It's superstition, which usually isn't idolatrous. It's just usually foolishness.
Okay, so we go again with the same
Right.
concept. Okay.
So, and because there are many different ways that humans have learned to be stupid, and doing things that are meant to be like a charm, or an amulet or some other form, that is often a problem. And like I said, it's not just a problem in other religions. There are many problems in.
We have a lot of things, especially during the Middle Age.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Some of both the history and the modern things that people do. And unfortunately, there are some people who treat mitzvot like sigulot, that that will actually take us. There's certain mitzvot, like shooing the mother away from the nest, where it says that you'll have a long life, and people will go out of their way to look for a nest if they're having trouble in life, in order to be able to do that mitzvah, so they can get the reward. And but the actual mitzvah is if you happen upon it, right? This is supposed to be spontaneous. It's just when it happens. Decision, right? Then the commandment kicks in. It's like you don't deliberately divorce your wife just so you can do the mitzvah of giving her a get, and then remarry her real quick. I mean, that's not the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be, if it happens, then the mitzvah kicks in.
Well, thank you for that, Robert.
Yes. All right. So that's a different type of, in my opinion. Sorry if it offends anybody who's watching or in the room. Using an amulet, a charm, some sort of form, rather than prayer, or getting a good realtor, which is kind of what today's Lunch and Learn was about doing everything within human power, and then you leave the little extra you can't do to God. That's the emphasis, rather than doing very little of your own and then hoping that some magic charm is going to do the trick. All right, 4:4.
Great. The idol of an idolater is prohibited immediately.
Go ahead and read part A, because it's going to take some unpacking.
Okay. But if it belonged to a Jew, it is not prohibited until it is worshipped.
All right.
Before you explain that, I have a problem with the translation here
Yes.
from Artscroll.
What did they get?
Because the idolater, here they translate as Gentile, but Gentile is a goy, is a non-Jew in general, no idolater. You can be a Gentile, but not an idolater.
Yes, that's true. So the translation is tricky, because the translation, if you were talking 2,000 years ago, would have been mostly true, right? Non-Jew equaled idolater 2,000 years ago for 99% of the world, if not more, right? If you were not Jewish, really the chances were 2,000 years ago you were an idolater. And so to translate it as non-Jew is somewhat faithful to the original idea of the authors. But you're right, in the modern world, where we have now, thank God, many people who live in the world, especially within our own country, that are not Jewish and not idolaters, using the term non-Jew or Gentile can be very misleading, because then it sounds like it's everybody. In this particular case, it's even more misleading, because the distinguishing character of the non-Jew in this story is they worship idols. Because if they didn't worship idols, then what we're about to say wouldn't apply. So they're not just any old non-Jew. They have to be an idolater for the first part of this Mishnah to be true. Because what the Mishnah is talking about here is, if I make a statue, right? Let's take I'm a wood carver, and I carve the picture of a statue. That's a guy in a big robe with a lightning bolt. If I am an idolater, as soon as I finish making that statue, bam, it is an idol 100%, and as a Jew, I would be prohibited from buying that from him. And if I went to his woodworking shop and there's a statue of a guy in a robe with a lightning bolt, I don't need to read the label. I don't need to check the price. I can't buy it because it's an idol. Yes, Patan?
You say something. You say.
I say all sorts of things.
No, I know, but when it's finished, I can't buy. But what about what is the definition of finish?
Right.
What happens if I say to the artist, you know what, don't complete something small, so it's not finished technically, so I can buy.
Right. So we'll talk about a little bit more in the next Mishnah about what annuls an idol, what makes an idol that was supposed to be an idol, not an idol. But it depends on whether or not it's considered a defect. Right. So it's like if your idol was, I'm trying to think of a good example. If your idol was for Bacchus, right, for Dionysus, right. And remember, we talked a little bit about broken idols in previous Mishnah, but let's imagine it was Dionysus. And I'm not sure about this, but let's imagine in order to be Dionysus, in order to be the representation of that god, it has to have a cup or grapes in its hands, because he was the god of wine.
Okay.
Right. So if you made a statue without the cup or the grapes, but just a statue that otherwise looked like him, but was missing the symbol of his divinity, then most people would probably agree that's not an idol. That's a statue of a guy.
What about if the cup is not completed? You lose something, or the
Right.
grapes.
Right. So the definition of complete is something that we always debate on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And in fact, that's a definition of complete for workmanship is a question that comes out for tumah, for ritual purity, ritual impurity, and ritual. Before, in Jewish law, before something that is a natural product can become susceptible to ritual impurity, it has to be finished. And there are many different discussions in Jewish law of what counts as finished. A very famous argument between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which is what led to a very sad fallout between them over that precise question. So finished is a very relative term, and it's one that needs debate, and it doesn't always have a clear answer, because it's so obvious of when it's finished. And the same would be true here. But when it is an idol, that is to say, at whatever point in the manufacture that it would be worthy of worship, let's just use that as a sort of general term, that it would be fit for worship. If someone put that in their house who believed in that God, they would bow to it. When it reaches that stage, then it is an idol. And as a Jew, I am now prohibited from having anything to do with it. But if I'm a Jew and I carve a statue of a guy in a long road with a big lightning bolt, and I write the word Zeus on the bottom of it, it's not an idol yet.
Because nobody's worshiping it.
Because no one's worshipped it yet. And there is not a presumption that it will be worshipped by me.
But
For an idolater, the presumption is if he made the idol, he made it within his mind the idea that this was a god and it would be worshipped. For a Jew, if he makes something that is identical to what the idolater made, we do not assume, although we're worried, but we don't assume that he's going to worship it until he does. And when he does, bam, now it's an idol and now it's prohibited.
But you say that it's forbidden for us to beneficiate from something. If you build on Zeus, okay, and you sell it, you are beneficiating for that process. And you know that will be an idol, probably.
If you sell it to a
If you sell it to an idolater.
Yes, so you know that you will, but we learned before, I don't know, a few Mishnah before, that it's forbidden for us to beneficiate.
But if you
So
don't
this-
know who you're selling it to, you're a wholesale statue maker.
The three monkeys, look at, don't ask, don't tell me, and that's it. It's a beautiful love.
Sometimes, yes. Look, I could make a beautiful painting of the world, right? And somebody comes along and buys it and they want to worship it. How am I supposed to know that's what they're going to do when they get it home? Does that mean I can't make a painting?
Yeah,
Right?
but
I plant a tree and I come back tomorrow and there's some guy bowing down to it. It's like, get out of here. This is-
yeah, but the probability to paint a tree or an sand, then and Zeus, that you know Zeus is a god, okay? It's a two different categories.
If you're in a community that worships Zeus, right? If someone wanted to make a statue of Zeus now as a historical model, let's say, or let's use Athena, right? Someone wanted to make, let's say they were a model builder, right? Because I like making models, so it's something I can imagine. And let's imagine I wanted to make a scale model of the Acropolis, or not the Acropolis, the Parthenon, right? Is it the Parthenon, Acropolis? I forget my Greek famous places. In Athens, the big building up on the hill, right? That was a temple for Athena. So let's imagine I want to make a model of that. Well, I'm going to need a statue of Athena to go in my model. No one around me is going to worship that. And even if I sold the model to someone else, I'm not going to assume that they're going to take that model home and bow down to it and put little offerings in front of it, because no one worships Athena around here. Anybody who buys this is buying it for the historical value or the artistic value. And that's permitted.
Today, what about 2,000 years?
If I live in the middle of Athens and I make a statue of Athena, I shouldn't be selling it to people. Because you're right, the presumption is that this is going to be worshipped. But even if I've made it, it's not technically an idol until someone bows down to it. So I don't have to treat it as an idol.
You have a good point, but I see this as a loophole.
Where you see loopholes, I see the boundaries. Sometimes leave some areas uncovered that we might have logically thought should be covered. That doesn't mean that they were a mistake. It doesn't mean they're a loophole. It just means this is where our sage believed that the oral law drew the line. And over there, it may still be a bad idea, but we can't claim that was prohibited by Torah. We can still recommend, don't do that. You know, one of my favorite examples was from our dean, my dean in rabbinic school, Rabbi Artson. And he said, you know, if God had made it a mitzvah not to eat junk food, he'd be 10 pounds lighter. But God didn't make that a mitzvah. Now, we recommend that you take good care of your body, right? If you talk to any rabbi, you read anything in the Mishnah about how we treat our body, we're supposed to take good care of it. But that's a recommendation more than a mitzvah, right? If we have to be honest about where is the line of the mitzvah says you can have a Snickers. Right? It's kosher. Doesn't mean it's good for your body, but you can definitely eat one and not be breaking Torah. And the rabbis were all about being very clear of where is the line, and then making recommendations on top of that. But they had to be clear what was their recommendation and what was the law. Make sense?
Yes.
Right. And leaving parts law or that are outside the law, what you call a loophole, isn't a mistake. It's being honest of the law only goes here, right? Just ad kan, that's it. And you shouldn't go over there, but I can only tell you not to go here. Because otherwise I would be inventing laws. I'd be inventing parts of the Torah that don't exist. And we're not allowed to do that. We can still make good advice, and we can still learn at, you know, this time or in this community, it's even better to be more strict, or sometimes we can be right up to the edge of the law to be more lenient, but we don't get to change where the actual law is. We can change recommendations, but the law is still the law. Okay, part 2.
An idolater can annul an idol belonging to himself or to another idolater, but a Jew cannot annul the idol of an idolater.
All right, so again, this comes back to intentions and such. So if an idolater annuls it, we're going to talk about that in more detail next Mishnah, but if an idolater annuls an idol, then it's no longer an idol. Now it's just a chunk of stone, a piece of wood, a bar of metal that happens to be in a particular shape. If they annul it, and that's in the next Mishnah, then it's okay. It's no longer. But I can't steal an idol from an idolater and say, this isn't an idol. If I stole it from him, it's still an idol, because his mind is still attached to this as a god. And my mind, even though I'm like, what idols? There's only one God, no statues. No matter how much I believe that, his mind is still controlling the status of this statue. And therefore, it's an idol. I don't get to just do whatever I want with it. I mean, I shouldn't be stealing in the first place, but that's just an extreme example. You know, imagine he gives it to me as a gift. Right? It's a more common possibility in the ancient world. Right? Your good friend, the Greek guy, wants to give you a gift because he loves you so much, and that's nice. But the gift he gives you is a big statue of Zeus. He believes it's a god. He believes that it should be bowed down to and worshipped. He believes it'll help you. He gives it to you, and inside, of course, you're saying, this isn't a god, this is a statue. It's still an idol. And you're not allowed to just take it home and put it on the mantelpiece as decoration. You have to say, no, this is an idol. No, this is not going to come into my house. Now, if you want to annul it, next Mishnah, then now we can talk. And similarly, if there's an idol seller who has bought an idol from someone and is now selling it to you, then yes, that person could also annul it, even if it wasn't theirs initially. But you are not allowed to do so. Only idolaters can de-idolify their item. Right? It doesn't come up all that often. Deconsecrate is the fancier word. But all right, part 3, similar topic.
Okay. He who annuls an idol annuls the things that pertain to it.
Right, so again, we're talking about a non-Jew or particularly an idolater annulling an idol. See next Mishnah. And when they annul it, the other things that are attached to it, its other ritual objects, they are also canceled. They are also now annulled. So if he does the annulment process on the statue, then the little bowl and the little glass and the little tray, all of those are also now annulled. It comes as a group. But
if he only annulled the things that pertain to it, these are permitted, but the idol itself is prohibited.
If he takes the idol off the tray and puts it down very carefully, respectfully, and says, this is still my God, but these tray things, yeah, I can annul these. And now, we can do a deal.
Made out of gold or silver.
Yeah, and we might be very happy to get them. Right?
Can't do it.
No, the items, yes, but the idol is still an idol. Right? So even if he annuls the things, he didn't annul the idol.
So because it was attached, we can't.
Right. The idol is still the idol. The things that are ancillary, secondary to it, they can have a different status. But the idol doesn't follow their status, but they follow the idol status. So if the idol goes down, they go down. If they go down, the idol doesn't change. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Are we ready to finally learn how to annul an idol?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, Mishnah 4:5.
So how does he annul it? If he cut off the tip of its ear, the tip of its nose, or the tip of its finger, or if he defaced it, although there was no reduction in the mass of the material, he has annulled it.
Okay.
So if we mutilate part of the body, it's enough.
Exactly.
One of the body.
Yeah, anything.
One. I don't need this and this, just one.
Yes. If I asked you to cut the Torah, would you say, well, can I cut it in Leviticus? Is that okay? Anywhere you cut it shows that you disrespect it. Right? Any place that you damage it. If I asked you to punch your mother, would you say, well, not in the face? Right? No, it's anything is disrespecting. And so if they are willing, and again, this is not like accidental damage. This has to be, they are damaging it to show that they do not believe that this is a God. Right? They're literally damaging God if they believed it was God, which people don't do if they believe it's God. Then that shows they don't believe it's God. And that's called annulling an idol. You look uncomfortable.
No, I was thinking about, I know that's not a good example, but I was thinking about the fringe of the pyramid in Egypt that lost the...
Oh, the Sphinx.
The spring that lost the noise.
Right. No, it was shut off by the French. Yes.
Yeah. But
Oh,
so it's,
Yes.
Okay.
so it's not more an idol because
Yeah.
it's mutilated.
But it was
If-
It wasn't an idol anyway.
But it wasn't mutilated by idolaters.
Yeah.
It was mutilated by French
Right.
soldiers
Yeah.
who
That's
had
what it
who
was.
had no sense of history.
But it's
It wasn't
interesting.
anyway. It wasn't an idol.
You know, I
The Sphinx was a...
The
I
fire.
don't know if the Sphinx itself was worshipped as an idol. I'm not sure. Certainly the Egyptian culture was idolatrous. I mean, they have lots of statues and things that we know very clearly they made offerings to and they bowed to and they worshiped. I mean, that is no question. But was the Sphinx one of those? I don't know. I would lean to guess that it probably was used for worship. I can't imagine they made something that looked like that and didn't. On the other hand, it could have simply been like a guardian symbol, you know, or something that was a monument rather than an object of worship. But I don't know 100% because I don't know my Egyptian history well enough. So
I don't think we ever studied that either.
What,
High
the
school, all about.
Egyptian history?
Mhm.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, definitely they were idolaters, but their whole pantheon and all of the different gods they worshipped, and they worshipped them straight up with idolatry, bowing and offerings. But the Sphinx, I don't remember whether that was more of a monument guardian thing or whether that was an object that they bowed to and worshipped. It's a good question. However, there is something that we need to qualify this. Right? We need to close a potential loophole.
If he spat before it, urinated before it, dragged it in the dust, or hurled excrement at it, behold, it is not an old.
Okay.
Why would we say that there is a lack of respect?
Okay.
It's nullified.
So here's where the lack of respect doesn't count enough, doesn't show a lack of divinity. And that's why, even though I used the term respect before, I knew this was going to get me into trouble. But I needed some sort of example that we could relate to, because we don't consider any object to be divine. Even the Torah, we don't consider the Torah to be God. So we don't have anything we can compare it to. So that's why I used respect until now. But here's what the problem is with this. Imagine your God has let you down. Imagine you're angry at your God. How do you show that you're angry at your God if you're an idolater? Right? You spit on it. You show that you're angry by doing these things to it, right? You push it down. What good are you? I lost at my, Las Vegas. You show your anger by doing these things, but you haven't diminished the statue. None of these things damage the statue. And that's the thing that's very important. You didn't break it. You didn't cut off the ear. It's still intact. All you did was show disrespect, but you were showing anger, and you were precisely showing anger because it was God, right? Because it was an idol. You were angry at that God for whatever reason, and so you did these things, but you still believed it was God. That's why you're angry at it, and you still believe it's a God enough that you didn't want to break it into a million pieces, or you didn't want to cut off its ear. If you'd done that, then that would have shown me that you really no longer believed this was a God. But most people don't go to that level. And when they don't go to that level, it's only halfway. And only halfway doesn't good enough for us for them to say that it's annulled.
Makes sense.
It does make sense. Does that work for everyone?
Yes.
Right. Again, it's kind of hard for us to imagine because we never think of any object as being a God to then imagine our relationship to the object. But that's what our sages had to do when dealing with idols. That's how the idolaters dealt with their objects. It's a weird way of looking at the world for us. Part 3.
If he sold or gave it as a pledge, Rabbi says that he has annulled it.
Right.
But the sages say that he has not annulled it.
So to come back to your question, when it comes down to a sale, just the sale in and of itself is not necessarily enough unless he does some symbol of an act, right? So if he clips the ear and sells you the idol, that's enough, right? But just selling or just using it for collateral, there was a debate, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he thought that was good enough, but the other Chachamim said not good enough. So it's right on the edge of whether that's enough, which was our argument.
Yes,
Yeah.
because I use in your argument,
Yeah.
I don't see anyone who does collateral at Torah or anything like that.
Right. Well, and you shouldn't. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says
Yes, that's why
it's good enough.
I tend to agree with the Rabbi.
Right. But because idolatry is such a problem, the Chachamim want a little more.
You wanna be
A little more.
safe.
You've already gone halfway to disrespecting and de-sanctifying it. Just something physical, a bit more.
Could be that they want a little more in order to save their life and not have problems with the majority of the community that living in that area, because most of them, they were living are in cities around palace, and maybe they were afraid that if it's so easy to desecrate and nullify, could open the door to problems with the authority or with the majority of the population, thinking that I nullify something when the other people say, no, for me it's still holy. So try to be safe.
Yes and yes. Right. So I think the primary motivation was really more of the fear of the idols influencing us. Right? That was our biggest danger always, was that if there are too many loopholes, if the border isn't strong enough, then these idols are going to come into our houses, and they will come in with some feeling of sanctity to them. They will have some sense that these are kind of divine because of the way these people treat them. And that means I may come to worship it. And that was the biggest problem that they were worried about preventing. But you're right, the way we treat the idols of the non-Jews, and the way we go around saying, that's annulled, that's annulled. If we did that, that would definitely make waves with the neighbors. I mean, we can see all the way to our own modern world. The way someone treats a symbol that you respect, if they treat it with disrespect, can make people just explode with anger and dissatisfaction, because symbols matter to people, and that's only symbols. So you can imagine if it's an idol, which people believe is their God, you're walking in dangerous territory. And so the rabbis generally didn't want us to have much to do with these things. But again, they had to show where the line was. All right, I think we still have time. Let's keep pushing, because the next topic introduces a little wrinkle.
An idol which its worshippers abandon in time of peace is prohibited.
Go ahead and read A.
In time of war, it is prohibited.
All right, so using your best, mental abilities, what's the difference? If the guy takes the idol when it's wartime and he, scratches the face off, why is that not annulled?
It's very simple, like for me, like very plain, because during war, maybe someone left in the rush at the city because the enemy were behind them and they forgot the idols they are, but they're really still thinking about the idols.
Right.
Or also maybe in the middle of a fight, some arrow crossed the idol.
The idol is damaged, right?
Figure, not because they want it, but because it's part of the war.
Right. Or maybe the enemies who worship different gods, they came in and desecrated the idols, but the original owners didn't desecrate those idols, and so it's still considered worship. Or maybe during the war they were losing, and temporarily they were angry at their god because of their loss, and so they said, this idol is no good because it's, I didn't get victory in the war, and so they damage it. But it was kind of like what we talked about before with being angry but not really rejecting, and that could be a problem. However, if everything's peaceful, if nobody's forcing you to do this, if there's no danger happening, if there's no other possible reason except that you have now decided that this idol is not God, then yes, during that time period, you can annul it. Again, makes good sense. Part 2.
Pedestals of kings are permitted because they set them up at the time of the king's passing.
All right, so again, this is ancient ways of living, not really something that we do nowadays. But apparently, I wasn't there, I'm not that old, but apparently what would happen would be when they have a special, the king is going to come through our city, because the king didn't visit like every day, maybe a few times in the whole lifetime, the king might come by. In order to make it a special parade, they would set up, pedestals, statues on top of the pedestals all along the road. When the king was done, they would often remove the statues, to use other places, but they leave the pedestals behind. And so the question is, well, those pedestals were set up so they could put statues on them, and then they took the statues off. Do the pedestals still count as being connected to the idolatry of the statue that was on it? Got the question? Right. And the answer is no. No, because they weren't really set up for the idolatry, they were set up for the king. And
what happens if they believe that the king is kind of a god?
Even if the king is kind of a god, the statue on the pedestals would have been the problem, but the pedestal itself wasn't considered part of the worship. It was just part of the decoration. That would have been, now if the pedestal was considered like a symbol of the world that, was part of the king's godly powers, then yeah, we've got a problem. But assuming it's just, a flat block that they could put the statue on, then the flat block is still a flat block when the king leaves, and it's okay. You can sit on it. Or
we had earlier, we had something
about what you put on top of other things, right? Okay, let's go ahead and read 4:7 because it's one of my favorite stories.
They asked the elders in Rome, if your God has no desire for idolatry, why does he not abolish it?
All right, so there were many different times when Jewish sages would go to Rome as like a lobbying group, right? This is early forms of AIPAC, and they needed to ask Rome for favors, or more likely to stop the persecution. And oftentimes when they were there, our rabbis would record some of the conversations they had with other people. So while they're in Rome, while the rabbis are in Rome, those are the elders that are being discussed here, they were asked, if your God doesn't like idolatry, why isn't it just, why isn't God just vaporizing idols everywhere?
Very simple, because of the free will. God created the human with a free will. That's what we are reading in Noah this Shabbat. And part of the free will is that you need to choose if you want to really believe in only one God or on idols.
Shoom, right over the head of the Romans. Who cares about free will? Right? Well, if God really doesn't like idolatry, why allow idols to stand? So they have to come up with an answer that's on the level that the questioner can understand and can appreciate, because they need to answer. You always answer the person in a way they will understand at their level. Right, so here's their response. But not to say your answer is wrong. Your answer was a good one, but it wouldn't have convinced the Romans. What did the Romans understand? The Romans understood power, right? They don't care about the freedom, because they were an empire. They took away freedom, so so they understood power, and so they want to know, if God is so powerful and God hates idolatry, why isn't God using his power to get rid of it? Because that's what the Romans would do. If they didn't like something, bang, they get rid of it. So here's the answer.
They replied, if it was something unnecessary to the world that was worshipped, he should abolish it.
He would abolish it.
He would abolish it. Who worship the sun, moon, stars, and planets? Should he destroy his universe on account of fools?
Great Jewish chutzpah, right? Because remember, they're talking to people that are idolaters. And he's saying, yeah, people worship all sorts of stuff. Things they worship, we all need, and God made, like the planet or the sun. So if someone goes, oh, mighty sun God, God destroys the sun, then the whole universe is destroyed, because some idiot worships something everywhere, right? Some fool is worshiping something, and if God had to destroy everything that every fool worshiped, there'd be no universe. However, they have a rebuttal.
They said to the elders, if so, he shall destroy what is unnecessary for the world and leave what is necessary for the world.
Right, so, which is actually a pretty good response,
yeah.
Right? Because if I told you, there are people who are stealing, and you said, well, stop them. And I said, well, if I can't stop all of them, you would tell me, stop some of them. Right? Okay, fine, you can't stop every thief, but if you can stop some thieves, you should stop some thieves. It's a good response. So, okay, fine. So God's not going to blow up the mountain just because somebody worshipped it. God's not going to blow up the sun. But my little statue of Zeus, if God doesn't like it, go ahead, zap it. Answer?
They replied, if he did that, we should merely be strengthening the hands of the worshippers of these, because they will say, know that these are deities, for behold, they have not been abolished.
Okay. So, again, people may be fools enough to worship things, but they are smart enough to still use logic to support their foolishness. That's that wonderful paradox of the human mind. So imagine, if you will, somebody who is worshiping the sun and somebody who's worshiping a statue. And God says, I don't like idolatry, but I don't want to destroy the world, so I'll destroy the statue. The guy who worships the sun turns to the guy who worships the statue and says, my God's better than your God, because my God didn't get destroyed. So now I feel better as a sun worshiper because all the statues got wiped out. I don't go, oh, there is only one God in the whole universe and I shouldn't be worshiping idols of any kind. I instead become more strongly confirmed in my faith that the sun is the real God, because when the idols were being wiped out, my sun didn't go anywhere. That's how the human mind works, right? I like to think sometimes this is what God's working with. Is he could do something as clear as wipe out all the idols, and people would still use it as proof to be more idolatrous towards the natural objects. That's not the way it works, which is what by the way, as a very subtle, maybe not subtle, depends how much the Romans were paying attention, criticism of Rome. You can try to use power to overcome and change the world to be just the way you want, but in the end, that doesn't work. In the end, just using power to keep beating down your enemies and beating down your opponents, it works for a little while, but it's also going to strengthen those you are not beaten down. So you need to overcome your enemies in other ways. And that's what God has tried to do, to overcome the enemy of idolatry. He didn't just go around blowing stuff up. He instead gave a message, what we call the Torah and what we call Judaism. And it has spread, and it's worked pretty well. Are we done yet? No. Not just with idolatry, but with all sorts of other issues. But we're better off now than we were before the Torah was given. I mean, both as Jews, of course, but also as humanity. So it's taken longer, but it's also been more effective.
And we win.
Yes, oh, we're certainly better off than we were,
Yes.
and we're closer to the goal line than we are to the start line. So it's moving in the right direction. So on that positive note, we will pause Avodah Zara on 4:7.